Please, help me. She whispered it so quietly that most people would have missed it. But Jack Carter wasn't most people. He set down his coffee cup, slowly, deliberately, and he looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Her hands were shaking, her eyes were wet. And behind the forced smile she wore like a uniform, there was something that made his chest tighten like a fist closing around his heart. Fear. Raw, exhausted, trapped fear. Before we go any further, if this story moves you, subscribe to this channel, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's see together how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The night it all started, Jack Carter had not planned to save anyone. He had planned to eat a cheeseburger. That was the whole plan, nothing complicated, nothing noble. He had been riding for 6 hours straight through 2 states, the kind of long highway ride that empties a man's head out completely, and his stomach had been growling since somewhere around the Kansas border. He had seen the Blue Lantern sign glowing through the rain from about half a mile away, and he had pulled off the highway because a neon light in the dark was as good a reason as any to stop. That was it. A cheeseburger and maybe a slice of pie if the pie looked decent. He killed the engine of his Harley-Davidson Road King and sat there for a second in the parking lot, letting the rain hit the back of his leather vest. The vest was worn in that particular way that only comes from years of actual wear, not the kind you buy pre-distressed at a mall somewhere. The patches on it told a story for anyone who knew how to read them, and most people, when they saw those patches, took a step back. Jack was used to that. He was 53 years old. He had a beard that was going gray faster than he liked to admit, and he had the kind of hands that looked like they had done real work. Calloused palms, thick fingers, knuckles that had seen better days. He stood 6'2" and carried himself the way men do when they have nothing left to prove to anyone, which is to say quietly and with a particular stillness that some people found more unsettling than noise ever could be. He pushed open the door to the Blue Lantern diner, and a little bell above it rang. Nobody looked up. Or rather, everyone looked up, caught themselves looking, and then very deliberately looked back down at their food. 2 older men at the counter, a family of 4 in a corner booth, the kids fighting over a coloring menu. A young couple by the window who had clearly been arguing before he walked in and had now gone silent in that specific way people do when they want to pretend they weren't. Jack took a seat at the counter, 3rd stool from the end, and picked up the laminated menu that was slightly sticky and smelled like it had been wiped down with a damp rag that had itself not been washed in a while. A waitress appeared. She came through the swinging door from the kitchen, moving fast, carrying 2 plates with the practiced ease of someone who had done this thousands of times, and she delivered them to the older men at the counter without spilling a drop, without missing a beat, and without losing the smile that was fixed to her face like something she had practiced in a mirror. Her name tag said Emily. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and eyes that were a shade of brown so deep they were almost black. She had the kind of face that would have been pretty if it weren't for the tension around the mouth and the shadows under her eyes that no amount of concealer was fully covering. She came to him next. "Hi, welcome to the Blue Lantern," she said, and the smile didn't waver. "What can I get you?" "Coffee," Jack said, "and a cheeseburger. Medium. Whatever comes with it is fine. We have fries or coleslaw." "Fries." She wrote it down. Her pen moved across the little notepad, and Jack noticed without meaning to notice, it was just the kind of thing his eyes caught, that her hand was trembling. Just slightly. Just enough. She went back through the swinging door. Jack drank his water and looked around the diner. It was the kind of place that had been somebody's dream. Once you could feel that in the architecture of it, the way someone had once cared enough to hang framed photographs on the walls and put little fake flowers in glass vases on each table. But the caring had stopped somewhere along the way. The photographs were dusty. One of the vases had a crack running down the side that somebody had tried to fix with what looked like a rubber band. The floor near the door was scuffed in a pattern that suggested the mat had been removed and never replaced. Small things. The kind of small things that accumulate when the person in charge has stopped paying attention to anything except money. The coffee arrived. Emily set it down in front of him and reached for the cream dispenser at the end of the counter, and that was when the kitchen door banged open hard enough to rattle the little bell above the front entrance, and a man came through it with the energy of someone who had been building toward an explosion for a while. I was in his mid-40s, shorter than Jack by several inches, with a face that had the particular redness of someone who was either perpetually angry or perpetually warm. And David Reynolds, owner of the Blue Lantern Diner, was not warm. Emily. His voice cut through the ambient noise of the diner the way a car horn does, sudden and sharp enough to make everyone flinch. Table 6 has been waiting for their check for 10 minutes. 10 minutes, Emily. What are you doing up here? Emily turned. The smile disappeared for exactly 1 second, and in that 1 second, Jack saw something that he recognized. The way you recognize a language you learned as a child and haven't spoken in years. Shame, the particular shame of someone who has been publicly humiliated so many times that the humiliation has started to feel like a fact of life rather than an injustice. I'm sorry, she said immediately. I'll get it right now. Sorry doesn't pay their bill, David said. He was looking at her in a way that made the two older men at the counter suddenly become very interested in their scrambled eggs. Sorry doesn't run this restaurant. You know what runs this restaurant? People who actually do their job. I understand. I'm going right now. Make sure you do. He looked around the diner, then a quick territorial sweep, and his eyes landed on Jack for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not fear exactly, but a recalculation. Then he went back through the kitchen door. The diner exhaled. Emily went to table 6 with the check. Jack watched her go. He watched the way her shoulders had curved inward, the way she moved just slightly faster. Now the way the smile had come back, but it was different now. Thinner, more brittle like glass that had already started to crack. He drank his coffee. He thought about the cheeseburger. He thought about the pee. He thought about being back on the highway with nothing but the engine sound and the road ahead. And then Emily came back to refill his coffee, and she reached past him for the pot, and she was close enough that he could hear the sound she was trying very hard not to make. She was crying, not dramatically, not in the way that demands attention. She was crying in the quiet, controlled way of someone who has learned to cry without anyone noticing. Tiny, silent tears that she was blinking back as fast as they came, her jaw tight, her hands steady, even though the rest of her was not. Jack looked at his coffee cup. He said quietly without looking up, "You all right?" She laughed. It was the saddest sound he had heard in a long time. "Of course," she said. "I'm fine. Can I get you anything else?" "Just the coffee," he said. She turned to go. "Emily." She stopped. He said it again the same quiet way, and this time he looked up and met her eyes. "I asked if you were all right." Something in his voice, not gentleness exactly, because gentleness can be patronizing, and this wasn't that something else. Steadiness. The voice of someone who was actually asking and actually intended to listen to the answer. She looked at him for a long moment. The whole diner was very quiet, and then in a voice so small he had to lean forward slightly to hear it, Emily Parker said, "Please help me." Just that, 3 words. And they hit Jack Carter's somewhere behind the sternum like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out in every direction. He didn't react the way people in movies react. He didn't stand up. He didn't make a speech. He didn't slam his hand on the counter and declare that justice would be served. He just said, "Okay, sit down for a second." "I can't sit down," she said quickly. "He'll see." "Then stand here and pretend to refill my coffee," Jack said, "and tell me what's going on." She did. Standing at the counter with the coffee pot in her hand, topping off a cup that was already full, Emily talked. Low and fast, with her eyes moving to the kitchen door every few seconds, like someone who has learned to track danger the way animals do. She told him that she had worked at the Blue Lantern for almost 3 years. She told him that the first 6 months had been fine. David had been demanding but not cruel the way managers can be demanding without crossing a line. But somewhere in the second year it had changed. She wasn't sure what changed in him, whether it was the business struggling or something in his personal life. But the criticism had started coming harder and more personal, and the tone had shifted from demanding to something else, something meaner. He called her incompetent in front of customers. He docked her pay for things that weren't her fault, a kitchen mistake, a table that complained about something she had no control over. He told her regularly that she was lucky to have the job, that no one else would hire her, that she wasn't smart enough or organized enough or good enough for anything better. "The worst part," she said, and her voice broke for just a second before she got it back under control. "The worst part is that I started to believe him." Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long ago did you start believing him?" She blinked. It was clearly not the question she expected. I don't know, maybe a year ago. And before that, before he started saying those things, what did you think of yourself? She looked at him like the question was in a foreign language. I, I don't remember, she said finally. Jack nodded slowly. That's what this kind of thing does, he said. It doesn't come in one big hit. It comes in little ones, every day, until you can't remember what you thought about yourself before. She stared at him. How do you know that? Because I've seen it before, he said. And he had, in places she didn't need to hear about right now. The kitchen door swung open again, and Emily straightened immediately. Coffee pot, Ray's professional smile locked back into place. But David wasn't looking at her. He was on his phone walking to the back booth where he sat sometimes when he was dealing with business, and he slid in without looking up. Emily let out a breath. Why haven't you left? Jack asked. Because I have nowhere to go, she said simply. No savings. My apartment is 3 blocks away, and it's cheap because David's cousin owns the building and gives me a reduced rate as part of my employment. She paused. I know how that sounds. It sounds like someone built walls around you very carefully, Jack said. She looked at him. I've thought about calling someone, a labor board or something, but I don't have any proof. It's my word against his, and he's been here for 20 years. His family built this restaurant. Everyone in this town knows him. Her voice went quiet. Nobody's going to believe me over him. What about the other employees? There's only me and the cook, Marcus, and Marcus has been here longer than I have. He keeps his head down. He's got a family. Jack was quiet again for a moment. The cheeseburger arrived from the kitchen, passed through window, and sat there getting slightly less hot while he thought. Okay, he said finally. Okay, what? Okay, I'm going to help you, he said, but I need you to understand something first. I'm not going to walk back there and put my hands on your boss. That's not how this works, and it won't fix anything, even if it feels like it would. Understand? She nodded. I'm going to ask you some questions, and then I'm going to make some phone calls, and this is going to take longer than tonight, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and at some point you're going to be scared enough to want to quit and pretend this conversation never happened. He looked at her steadily. When that happens, I need you to remember that you said those 3 words to me, and I came here for a cheeseburger, and I didn't have to answer. Emily looked at him for a long time. Why would you do this? She asked. And Jack Carter said something that she would remember for the rest of her life. Because you asked. Most people never ask, and everyone who doesn't ask deserves someone who'll answer anyway. But you asked, so here I am. He picked up the cheeseburger and took a bite. It wasn't half bad, actually. The next 2 hours unfolded quietly, the way important things often do not, with fanfare but with slow, methodical accumulation of truth. Jack ate his dinner and Emily worked her tables. In between trips, she came back to him and answered his questions in fragments a little more each time, like someone draining water from a place that had been flooded too long. Jack listened to all of it. I was good at listening. It was not a skill that had come naturally to him. He had spent a lot of years being too loud in one way or another. But somewhere in his 40s, he had learned that listening was the most powerful thing a person could do in most situations, and he had practiced it the way other men practice throwing a football or playing guitar with discipline and attention. He learned that Emily had moved to Willow Creek from Louisville 3 years ago, following a boyfriend who had subsequently not worked out, leaving her stranded in a town where she knew no one with a waitressing job that had seemed like a temporary solution and had become permanent by default. He learned that she had 2 years of community college behind her and had once considered a degree in business administration, but had let that dream get smaller and smaller until it had almost disappeared. He learned that she had called her mother once 6 months ago and tried to explain what her life had become, and her mother had said in the well-meaning but devastating way that parents sometimes do, "Well, honey, you should have thought about that before you followed that boy out there." After which, Emily had not called her mother again. He learned that she had a neighbor, a woman in her 60s named Ruth, who sometimes left meals outside her door when she heard Emily come home late. Ruth was the closest thing Emily had to a friend in this town, and Ruth had said to her once in passing, "That man's not right, honey, and anybody with eyes can see it," but had said nothing further, and Emily had not pushed. And he learned this part came last, and it came in the quietest voice she had used all night, that 2 weeks ago David had taken $40 from her tips without explanation, And when she had asked about it, he had told her she had been sloppy with a customer order and the money was to cover his cost. When she had pointed out carefully and with her heart hammering in her chest that the order mistake had been the kitchen's error and not hers, he had said, "You keep talking back to me like that, and there won't be any tips to worry about, or a job, or an apartment." And she had gone silent because she had believed him. When the diner started emptying out around 9 o'clock, Jack paid his bill. He tipped Emily $60, which was triple what the meal cost, and he did it without commentary, and he put on his jacket and he said, "I'll be back tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. Emily looked alarmed. "You can't just come back here. If he sees you, he'll see a customer having breakfast," Jack said. "That's all." "You don't know David." "No," Jack agreed, "but David doesn't know me either." He zipped his jacket. 7 o'clock, Emily. I'll have coffee. You'll tell me who else has worked here in the last 5 years. Names if you have them, anything you remember. She hesitated. "Why?" "Because you said you had no proof," Jack said. "And nobody ever only does something to one person." He looked at her steadily. "He's done this before. And the people he did it to, some of them are still in this town, and some of them might be ready to talk." He walked out into the rain. Behind him through the diner window, he could see Emily standing at the counter, watching him go. She had her hand pressed flat against the countertop, steadying herself. She looked like a person standing at the edge of something very tall, trying to decide if they were brave enough to jump. Jack got on his Harley. I didn't start it right away. He sat there in the parking lot for a minute, hands on the handlebars, rain on his shoulders, thinking about what he had just done and what it was going to require of him. I thought about his ride. He thought about the week he had planned, which had been loose and uncommitted and free in the way he had grown to need his life to be. He thought about the fact that he did not know this woman had not known her 2 hours ago and was not obligated to her in any way that the world would recognize. And then he thought about 3 words spoken in a tiny, desperate voice over a coffee pot. "Please help me." He started the engine. The sound of it rolling through the empty parking lot was immense and certain and alive. And Jack Carter rode around the corner to the only motel in Willow Creek and checked himself into room 7, and he lay on top of the bed with his boots still on and stared at the ceiling, and he made a list in his head of everything he needed to do. Because somewhere in a diner 3 blocks away, a young woman with shaking hands and hollow eyes had trusted him with the most vulnerable thing she had. And Jack Carter had never once in his life walked away from a trust like that. He would be back at 7. And this time when the walls David Reynolds had built around Emily Parker's life started to come down, and they would come down, Jack was certain of that, the way he was certain of gravity and weather and the reliability of a well-maintained engine. David Reynolds would discover something he had apparently not yet learned in 40-some years of living. There is a difference between power and strength. Power is what you take from people who can't stop you. Strength is what you choose to give to people who need it. David had spent years confusing one for the other. Tonight, that confusion was going to start costing him. Jack was back at 7 o'clock exactly. He didn't announce himself. He didn't make a production of it. He walked through the front door of the Blue Lantern the same way he had the night before, quietly, deliberately taking the same stool at the counter. And when Emily came out of the kitchen and saw him sitting there, something moved across her face that was too complicated to name. Relief and terror braided together. She brought him coffee without being asked. "You actually came," she said quietly. "I said I would. People say things." She set the pot down. "They don't always mean them." Jack looked at her over the rim of the cup. "I mean what I say. You'll figure that out." She watched him for a second, and then she glanced toward the kitchen door. A reflex automatic, the way a person checks for traffic before stepping into a street, and then she leaned slightly forward. "He's in the back. He gets here at 6:30, and he's on the phone until about 8. We have maybe 40 minutes before he starts moving around." "Then let's use them," Jack said. "Names, anyone who used to work here, anyone who quit, got fired, left under circumstances that felt wrong. Start talking." Emily had clearly been thinking about this. She had clearly been up most of the night thinking about it, because the names came out organized with detail, with the kind of specificity that only comes when someone has been quietly cataloging injustice for a long time and finally has a place to put it. There was Sandra Kowalski, who had been the head waitress before Emily and who had lasted 4 years before quitting abruptly 18 months ago. Emily knew she still lived in town, worked at the pharmacy on 4th Street. She had never said publicly why she left, but Emily had heard her crying in the bathroom once 3 weeks before she quit, and Sandra had come out of the stall with her eyes red and her jaw set and had said, "Don't let this place swallow you whole, honey," and then had never brought it up again. There was a cook named Pete Larson who had been fired 2 years ago. Emily didn't know exactly what happened. She hadn't been there yet, but Marcus, the current cook, had mentioned Pete once in passing and stopped himself mid-sentence in a way that suggested there was a great deal more to that story than he wanted to share. There was a teenage girl, a summer hire named Kayla, who had worked the weekend breakfast shift for one summer and never come back. Emily had overheard David on the phone with someone once laughing about how Kayla couldn't handle the real world. Emily had thought nothing of it at the time. Now she thought about it differently. And there were others, smaller presences, people who had drifted through the diner and drifted back out, some after weeks, some after months, all of them sharing the particular quality of having left quietly without confrontation, without public explanation. Jack listened to all of it. He didn't write anything down. Emily noticed that he just listened, and she had the strange sensation that every word she said was being filed away somewhere inside him with perfect accuracy. "Sandra Kowalski," he said when she finished. "The pharmacy on 4th Street. What time does she start?" 9, I think. Maybe 9:30. "Pete Larson, you know where he is now." "I heard he's doing construction. There's a crew that works the new development on the east side of town. I've seen a truck with Larson's name on it." Jack nodded and drank his coffee and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did any of these people ever talk to each other after they left? Do they know each other's stories?" Emily shook her head. "I don't think so. This town is small, but people they keep things separate. You know how it is." "I know exactly how it is," Jack said. "That's how he's been counting on it staying." The kitchen door opened, and Marcus came through with a tray of clean glasses, and he looked at Jack the way he always looked at Jack, with careful neutrality. The expression of a man who has perfected the art of not seeing things that might require him to respond to them, and set the glasses on the shelf and went back through without a word. Jack watched him go. "Marcus," he said. "He won't talk," Emily said immediately. "I've thought about it. He's been here 9 years. He has a daughter in college. He needs this job." "Everybody needs something," Jack said. "Doesn't mean he hasn't seen things. Knowing something and saying something are different things." "They are," Jack agreed, "but sometimes the distance between them is smaller than people think. It just needs the right kind of bridge." He set down his cup. "I'm going to talk to Sandra today. And Pete, if I can find him, I need you to do something for me while I'm doing that." Emily straightened slightly. "What?" "I need you to start writing things down. Not for me, for yourself. Dates, times, what happened, what was said, what the situation was. Everything you can remember. Even things that seem small. Especially things that seem small." "Why, Amo?" "Because memory is unreliable and paper is not," Jack said. "And because the moment you write something down, it stops being just your word against his. It becomes a record. Records matter." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I wrote some things in a journal once, a couple months ago. I stopped because it felt pointless." "Go find that journal," Jack said, "and don't stop this time." The front door opened and a couple of regulars came in, and Emily straightened and turned on the smile like switching on a light, and Jack watched her do it and felt something tighten in his chest. The ease of that switch, the speed of it. That was what years of practice looked like, and it was not something anyone should have had to practice. He left 40 minutes later before David emerged from the back, and he spent the rest of the morning doing exactly what he had said he would do. Sandra Kowalski was behind the pharmacy counter when he walked in, a woman in her late 30s with a brisk, efficient manner and the particular wariness of someone who has learned not to trust easily. When Jack introduced himself, not as a Hell's Angel, not by his road name, just as Jack, a friend of someone who used to work at the diner, Sandra's face did something complicated. "I don't talk about that place," she said immediately. Her voice was flat and final. "I'm not asking you to talk," Jack said. "I'm asking you to listen. 2 minutes. And then you can tell me to leave and I'll leave." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped out from behind the counter and led him to a small break room in the back. She crossed her arms and leaned against the wall. 2 minutes? Jack told her about Emily. Not everything, just enough. The docked tips, the public humiliation, the apartment tied to the job. He watched Sandra's face as he talked, and he watched the thing she was trying to keep contained start pressing against the edges. When he finished, Sandra was quiet for 10 seconds. Then she said, "She's not the only one." "I know," Jack said. "He docked my pay too, multiple times, said I was making errors. I kept records. I kept meticulous records, and I brought them to him, and he told me I was imagining things, that I was confused." Her voice was controlled, but her arms had tightened across her chest. "He told me no one would believe a woman with a bad memory over a business owner with 20 years in this town." "Did you believe him?" Sandra's jaw tightened. "For long enough," she said. "Yeah. Would you be willing to put what happened to you in writing?" The silence that followed was the longest yet. Jack didn't fill it. He had learned that you can't rush someone toward courage. You can only make sure the door's open. "Who would I give it to?" she asked finally. "Me for now," he said. "I'm building something. I don't know exactly what shape it's going to take yet, but I'm building it, and the more stones I have, the stronger it gets." Sandra looked at him for a long time. "You're a biker," she said. "I am. Why do you care what happens to a waitress you don't know in a town you don't live in?" Jack considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. "Because she asked me to," he said, "and because the only way this kind of thing keeps working is if everyone who sees it decides it's not their problem." He held her gaze. "Is it your problem, Sandra?" Her throat moved. She looked away for a second and then back. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes, I think it is." He found Pete Larson at noon, exactly where Emily had said he would be, at the East Side Development eating lunch in the cab of a truck, with his name painted on the door. Pete was a big man with a sunburned neck and hands that made even Jack's look delicate, and he opened the truck window with the expression of someone expecting a salesperson and finding something he couldn't immediately categorize. Jack was good at making himself non-threatening when he needed to be. He leaned against the truck and he talked to Pete the same way he had talked to Sandra, direct, honest, without pressure. And Pete listened with his lunch going cold in his hand and his face getting progressively less neutral. Pete had been fired, not quit, fired. And the reason David had given to Pete's face, and apparently to anyone in town who asked, was theft. A missing deposit from the register one Thursday night. Pete had denied it, had never been charged because there was no evidence. There was no evidence because Pete hadn't done anything, but in a town the size of Willow Creek, the accusation alone had done its work. "He told people I stole from him," Pete said. His voice was very level, the kind of level that comes from a long time spent deciding not to be as angry as you actually are. "You know what it's like trying to build a business in a town where people think you're a thief?" "I can imagine," Jack said. "No," Pete said. "No, you can't actually. You can't imagine what it is to have a man take your reputation, the thing you've built your whole working life, and just throw it into the trash because you didn't go along with what he wanted." He stopped. He looked out through the windshield. "I needed extra hours that month. My daughter had an ER visit, big bill. I asked if I could pick up some extra shifts. He said he'd think about it. Next thing I know, I'm being accused of theft, and I'm out on my ear." "The accusation and the request were connected," Jack said. Pete looked at him. Yeah, I think they were. I just couldn't prove it." "You've never told anyone this?" "Your version." "Who was I going to tell? His family's been in this town longer than mine. His uncle's on the town council." Pete shook his head. "I said my piece to a couple people right after it happened. Nobody wanted to hear it." "Someone wants to hear it now," Jack said. "A young woman who's been going through her own version of what you went through, and she's not going to go through it alone anymore." Pete looked at him for a long moment. Something was moving in his face, something old and banked and still warm despite the time. "What do you need from me?" he asked. This was the moment. This was the small, quiet, ordinary moment that looked like nothing from the outside, but was in fact everything. Because Pete Larson had spent a year and a half carrying something that had bent him, and now someone was asking if he wanted to set it down. And the answer was yes. It had always been going to be yes. It was just a matter of someone asking with the right combination of honesty and steadiness and zero expectation of any particular answer. "Write it down," Jack said. "Dates, facts, what happened, what was said, the request for hours, the accusation, the timing, all of it. And if when the time comes you're willing to say it in a room full of people, we'll cross that bridge when we get there." Pete nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Just that. Jack shook his hand and walked back to his motorcycle. By 4 o'clock, he had spoken to 3 more people. A former busboy who had been a teenager at the time and was now 19 and working at a garage, and who had it turned out witnessed David skim cash from the register himself and been told if he ever mentioned it, he would tell the boy's parents that their son had been the one taking money. The boy had been 16. He had been terrified. He had stayed quiet for 3 years. He didn't want to stay quiet anymore. A woman named Gloria, who had been a regular customer at the diner for 15 years and had stopped coming 8 months ago because she had watched David reduce Emily to tears in front of a full dining room and had gone home and cried about it herself and had felt guilty ever since for not saying anything at the time. Gloria didn't have testimony exactly, but she had something almost as powerful, the witness account of someone who had no stake in the outcome and no reason to lie. And Ruth, Emily's neighbor, the woman who left meals outside her door. Jack found Ruth sitting on her front porch with a cup of tea and an expression that suggested she had been expecting someone to come along and ask questions for quite some time. I wondered when something was going to happen, Ruth said before Jack had even finished introducing himself. That poor girl. You can hear her through the walls sometimes. Not crying, just the silence. You know the kind of silence I mean. When someone is holding themselves together so hard, the whole apartment goes quiet. I know the kind, Jack said. I don't have anything official, Ruth said. I'm just an old woman next door. Tell me anyway, Ruth told him. She had been watching Emily for a year. She had noticed the pattern of it, Emily coming home later, and later leaving earlier and earlier. The way she moved when she came through the building's front door, hunched and fast like someone trying to take up less space. Ruth had made her meals because she hadn't known what else to do, and because something in her had recognized with the particular recognition of a woman who had had her own version of this story 40 years prior, what she was looking at. Has she said anything to you about it? Jack asked. Not directly, Ruth said. Girls like her, they protect you. They don't want to burden anyone. They've been told so long that they're a burden that they start acting like one preemptively. She looked at Jack steadily. You're going to fix this. I'm going to try. Jack said honestly. I can't promise how it ends, but I can promise that she's not alone anymore. Ruth nodded. She sipped her tea. You're a good man, she said simply. Whatever else you are. Jack didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which was the right answer. He went back to the diner at closing time 9:30 and waited in the parking lot. The last customers filed out. The lights inside dimmed from the main room down to just the kitchen. After another 20 minutes, Marcus came out through the back, got into his car and left. Then David's car was in the lot. And then eventually the front door opened and Emily came out, and she stopped when she saw Jack sitting on his motorcycle in the parking lot, and she walked over quickly. He's still inside, she said quietly. He's always the last one out. What are you doing here? I wanted to tell you about my day, Jack said. Emily stared at him. Your day. I talked to Sandra Kowalski. She's writing things down. I talked to Pete Larson. Do you know what David accused him of when he fired him? He told her. Emily's hand went to her mouth. A 16-year-old busboy who watched David take money from the register. A customer named Gloria who saw what happened to you 8 months ago and has been carrying the guilt of not speaking up ever since. And Ruth. Emily went very still. Ruth talked to you. Ruth has been watching over you for a year, Jack said. She knows more than you think. Emily's eyes were bright. How did you find all these people? Because they were there, Jack said. They've always been there. Every single one of them was ready to say something. They just needed someone to ask. He looked at her. You thought you were alone in this. You weren't. You were just in separate rooms from everyone else who'd been through the same thing. My job today was to open the doors. Emily was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was unsteady. What happens now? Now we figure out the right place to put all of this, Jack said. I have some calls to make. I know some people not in this town, but people who know how these situations work. Labor attorneys, journalists, people who understand how to take information and turn it into something that can't be ignored. He looked at her. But that's tomorrow. Tonight I need you to go home and get your journal and write down everything you told me last night. Every detail. Start from the beginning. Emily nodded. She was holding herself very carefully the way people do when they're right at the edge of something. Jack, she said, yeah. What you said last night about why you're doing this. She looked at him. Did you mean it, all of it? Which part? The part where you said everyone who doesn't ask still deserves someone who will answer. She paused. I've been thinking about that all day. I've been thinking about all the times I almost asked someone and talked myself out of it. Why did you ask me? Jack said. Specifically, why me last night? She thought about it seriously. Because you looked at me like I was a person, she said finally. Not a waitress, not a problem. A person. Her voice was very quiet. You'd be surprised how rare that is. Jack looked away for a moment, then back. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. She nodded and started to walk toward the street. Then she stopped and turned back. You know he's going to find out what you're doing, she said. What happens then? Jack thought about it. Then we find out what he's made of, he said. Emily looked at him for one more second. Then she turned and walked home. Jack sat in the parking lot for a while after that, not moving. The night was quiet. Somewhere nearby, a dog was barking at something it couldn't see, persistent and certain in its alarm, even in the dark. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in almost a year. A woman named Rachel Morgan, who had once told him in a different context, in a different kind of situation, that she specialized in what she called broken systems. She fixed them. Businesses, organizations, structures that had been built on bad foundations and needed someone with the expertise and the nerve to tear down the bad parts without collapsing the whole thing. He sent her a text. I need your help with something. Call me when you can. Then he sat there and thought about Emily's face when he'd listed the names. Sandra, Pete, Gloria, Ruth, the 16-year-old kid who'd been too scared to breathe a word for 3 years. I thought about the way she'd looked, not relieved exactly, but something more fundamental than relief. The look of someone who has been told their entire perception of reality is wrong, that the thing they saw wasn't real, that they imagined it, that they're too sensitive, too weak, too dramatic, and who then discovers not only that it was real, but that other people saw it too and kept it and carried it and were waiting for exactly this moment to put it down. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being the only one who knows the truth about something. It's different from regular loneliness. It's heavier. It has the specific weight of a thing you can't share. David Reynolds had kept Emily in that loneliness deliberately. He had kept all of them there, in separate rooms, convinced that their experience was singular, private, too small to matter, or too large to prove. Jack had spent the day opening doors between the rooms, and now they were all in the same hallway. What happened next depended on how many of them were willing to walk forward together. His phone buzzed. Rachel Morgan. 12 minutes after his text. She had always been fast, in the middle of something. Can talk in an hour. This important. Jack looked at the diner, at the light still on inside where David was doing whatever David did at the end of his days alone in his restaurant, unaware that the ground beneath him had just shifted. He typed back, yeah, it's important. Then he started his bike and rode back to the motel, and for the first time since he had pulled into Willow Creek the night before, he felt something that might have been, if not quite hope, then the solid structural predecessor to hope, the kind of thing you build on. Rachel Morgan called back 57 minutes after Jack's text, which meant she had wrapped up whatever she was doing with 3 minutes to spare, which was exactly the kind of person Rachel Morgan was. She was 47 years old, ran a consulting firm out of Chicago that she had built from nothing over 20 years, and she had the particular quality that Jack had always admired in people who were genuinely good at something. She didn't perform competence, she just had it quietly and completely, the way some people are tall. Jack had met her through a mutual friend 8 years ago, under circumstances that were complicated and that he had never fully explained to anyone and didn't intend to start explaining now. What mattered was that Rachel understood broken things. She understood how systems of control worked, how one person could construct a world around themselves in which they were untouchable. And more importantly, she understood how to dismantle those systems without blowing up everything in the process. Tell me, she said when he picked up. He told her, all of it this time. 30 minutes start to finish while he sat on the edge of the motel bed with his boots still on and his jacket thrown over the chair. Rachel didn't interrupt. She never interrupted. She stored things and assembled them as she went, and when he was done, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. He counted, and then she said, the apartment tied to employment is the most important piece. I thought the stolen tips. The tips matter, but they're harder to prove in isolation. The apartment is structural. If his cousin owns the building and the rate is tied to her employment, That's coercive housing as a condition of labor. That's not just an ethical violation depending on how it's structured, that may be a legal one. He heard her typing something. Does she have anything in writing about the housing arrangement? I don't know, I'll find out. If she does, that's where we start. The rest of it, the public humiliation, the doc tips the pattern with former employees, that builds the picture. But you need an anchor, something concrete and documented that a lawyer can pick up and hold. More typing. I know someone in Kansas City, labor attorney named Diane Cho. She does a lot of pro bono work on wage theft and hostile work environment cases. I can call her tomorrow morning. I'd appreciate that. Jack, her voice shifted slightly. How solid is this girl? Because what's coming if we go forward with this, it's going to get worse before it gets better. It always does. The moment this man feels cornered, he's going to come at her with everything he has, her job, her apartment, her reputation in that town. You need to know she can hold. Jack thought about Emily. He thought about 3 words over a coffee cup. He thought about her standing in the parking lot, holding herself together with the discipline of someone who had been doing it for so long, it had become muscle memory. She's held for 3 years already, he said. She's been holding alone. She won't be holding alone anymore. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. I'll call Diane in the morning. In the meantime, the written accounts from the former employees are critical. Get them to write in their own words, their own handwriting, or their own typed document signed and dated. No coaching on language. The authenticity matters as much as the content. Understood. And Jack, keep yourself out of it as much as you can. I know that's not your natural mode. What's that supposed to mean? It means that a Hell's Angel inserting himself into a small-town labor dispute has a very specific narrative that people will use to discredit everything around it. The story needs to be about her, about all of them, not about you. He knew she was right. He didn't love it, but he knew she was right. Understood, he said again. He hung up and sat there for a moment in the quiet of the motel room, and then he lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Rachel had said. It's going to get worse before it gets better. He thought about Emily going home to that apartment, owned by David's cousin, 3 blocks from the diner. The apartment that was not just shelter, but a chain, the elegant, invisible kind that people construct when they want to keep someone in place without ever touching them. He closed his eyes. He was asleep within 4 minutes, which was another skill acquired over years of living in circumstances that required rest whenever it was available. In the morning, things moved fast. Emily had done exactly what he asked. When he arrived at the diner at 7, she was ready, and between customers, she passed him a folded piece of paper under the pretense of clearing his table, her hand steady. This time he noticed where before it had shaken, and he unfolded it in his jacket pocket later and found 11 pages front and back in tight, careful handwriting. Dates, times, direct quotes as best she could remember them. The day David had called her stupid in front of a table of 8 customers who had sat in frozen silence. The week he had docked $200 from her pay and told her it was for breakage she had not caused. The conversation about the apartment transcribed with a precision that told him she had replayed it in her head many times. 11 pages, 3 years, compressed into the tight handwriting of someone who had finally allowed themselves to call a thing what it was. He folded the pages back into his pocket and finished his coffee. At 8:15, David came through the kitchen door. He saw Jack at the counter and stopped. Just for a second, a tiny hesitation that most people would have missed, but Jack was watching for it and caught it cleanly. David recovered fast. He came to the counter with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades managing his own presentation, and he said pleasantly enough, "Back again." "Good coffee," Jack said. David smiled. It was a particular kind of smile, wide enough to look friendly, not wide enough to reach the eyes. "Emily taking good care of you." "Very good care," Jack said. Something moved through David's expression. Not quite a question, not quite suspicion, a calculation. "You passing through?" "I'm in no hurry," Jack said. The calculation deepened. David stood there for 2 seconds longer than he needed to, and then he said, "Well, let us know if you need anything," and walked back through the kitchen door. Emily appeared at Jack's elbow 40 seconds later. "He's going to ask Marcus about you," she said quietly. "He always asks Marcus when something seems off." "Let him ask," Jack said. "You're not worried about what? I'm a customer drinking coffee." He looked at her. Did you ever get anything in writing about the apartment? Any letter, email, anything that mentions the reduced rate, Emily thought. There might be an email. From when I first moved in, his cousin sent me lease terms. I need you to find that email today if you can. Why? He told her briefly without going into Rachel's full analysis that the housing arrangement was important. He watched Emily absorb this and watched something change in her face, a shifting like a lens coming into focus. I never thought of it that way, she said slowly. I just thought of it as a good deal that kept me stuck. It was designed to feel like a good deal, Jack said. That's how those things work. Before she could respond, a crash came from the kitchen. The sound of something metal hitting tile, and David's voice followed it sharp and cutting. Emily, get back here. Emily flinched. It was small and fast, and she controlled it immediately, but Jack saw it, and the sight of it did something to his jaw. She went. He sat there and drank the rest of his coffee and reminded himself what Rachel had said. Keep yourself out of it. The story needs to be about her. He lasted exactly 4 minutes. Then David's voice came through the kitchen door again, not words this time, but tone, the particular tone of someone pressing down on a pressure point, and Jack heard Emily's voice responding low and placating. And then David's again, louder now. And Jack set down his cup with the careful deliberateness of someone who is making a choice. He did not go through the kitchen door. He sat there. And 2 minutes later, Emily came back out carrying 2 plates for a table in the corner, and her face was completely composed. The professional mask, perfect, impracticed, and impenetrable. She delivered the plates without a tremor, but when she came back past Jack, she said so quietly it barely existed. He knows something's different. I don't know how, but he knows. What did he say? He said I seemed distracted. He said if my head wasn't in the job, he'd find someone whose head was. She stopped at the counter and straightened the napkin holder. He wasn't yelling. That's when he's scariest. When he stops yelling and goes quiet. Jack thought about that. How long until your lunch break? Noon. Come find me at noon. I'll be at the park on 2nd Street. She nodded and moved away, and Jack left the diner and spent the next 3 hours making phone calls. Rachel had spoken to Diane Cho that morning, and Diane Cho wanted to speak to Emily. This was the first real piece of forward momentum, a labor attorney willing to take a preliminary look pro bono based on what Rachel had described. Jack relayed this information to Emily at noon in the park, sitting on a bench with Emily eating a sandwich she'd brought from the diner kitchen, and both of them talking in the low, urgent tones of people who are aware they might be seen. Emily's reaction was not what he expected. She went pale. An attorney, she said. Yes. That means this is becoming a real thing. It's been a real thing, Jack said. We're just giving it the framework it needs. I know, but... She put down the sandwich. When I asked you for help, I was thinking, I don't know what I was thinking. Someone to talk to, maybe. Someone to tell me it wasn't in my head. She looked at her hands. I wasn't thinking attorneys. I wasn't thinking former employees and written statements and... She stopped. What if this goes badly? Define badly. What if he finds out before we're ready and he fires me? What if he kicks me out of the apartment? What if he tells people in this town that I made things up, that I'm unstable, that I was a bad employee? Her voice was very controlled, but underneath the control, he could hear the thing that had kept her quiet for 3 years. This is a small town, Jack. His family has been here forever. If he decides to come after my reputation, Emily, he said her name the way he always said it, not to shut her down, but to make sure she was actually in the room with him and not in one of the catastrophic futures her brain was building. She looked at him. What you're describing, those are real possibilities. I'm not going to tell you they're not. But here's the other real possibility. Right now today in this town, Sandra Kowalski is writing her account. Pete Larson wrote his last night, I have it already. The busboy, his name is Tyler. He's 19 and he is angry in the way young people get when they have held something too long. Tyler is ready to say exactly what he saw. Gloria has agreed to provide a witness statement. And Ruth, he paused. Ruth wrote 4 pages, said she'd been waiting for 2 years for someone to ask. Emily's eyes were filling. You thought you were one person against him, Jack said. You're not. You were never one person. You were just the first one willing to say it out loud. She pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. Then she dropped it and looked at him directly. Okay, she said. Okay, I want to talk to the attorney. She picked up the sandwich again. What do I need to do? That was the moment. That was the one he would remember later. Not the confrontation that was coming, not the community meeting, not the resolution, but this one. A young woman in a park picking up a sandwich, saying, "Okay, I'm ready." The courage in it was so ordinary it was almost invisible, and that was the truest thing about it. Diane Cho spoke to Emily by phone that afternoon for 45 minutes while Emily sat in Ruth's apartment because it was the only place she was certain David's cousin didn't have access to. Jack waited in Ruth's kitchen and drank Ruth's tea, and Ruth sat across from him and didn't say anything for a long time, just watched him with the particular calm attention of a woman who has lived long enough to know when something important is happening and to resist the urge to narrate it. Finally, Ruth said, "You're not what people think you are." Jack looked at her. "What do people think I am? Someone to be afraid of." "People aren't wrong to be cautious around someone they don't know," Jack said. "No," Ruth agreed, "but there's a difference between caution and judgment. You walked into that diner and you saw her. You didn't see a stranger or a problem or a pretty girl or a waitress. You saw a person who needed help and you decided to help her. That's not complicated, but a lot of people go their whole lives without being able to do it." Jack was quiet for a moment. "My mother was in a situation like Emily's," he said. He said it the way you pull a thorn out quickly, because the longer you hesitate, the harder it gets. "Not a job, a marriage. Long time ago. I was 12, 13. I watched it happen, and I couldn't do anything because I was a kid and I didn't know what to do." He looked at his hands on Ruth's kitchen table. "You don't forget something like that. It just lives in you somewhere, waiting for a chance to do it different." Ruth was quiet. Then she said gently, "And here you are." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The door to the back room opened, and Emily came out. Her eyes were dry but wide, and she held her phone in both hands like it was something fragile. She looked at Jack, and she said, "She thinks we have a case, a real one." She said the combination of the housing arrangement, the docked wages, the pattern of behavior across multiple employees, she said it's significant. Jack nodded. He'd expected this, but hearing it still settled something in him. "She also said," Emily continued, and here her voice changed, dropped half a register, became more careful, "that the most powerful thing would be if we could get people to speak publicly, not just written statements, but actually in a public setting, where it's on record, where David is present." She paused. She mentioned something about a community business review. "Willow Creek has them twice a year. There's one scheduled in 3 weeks." The room was quiet. "She thinks we should go," Emily said. Jack thought about this. "She's right," he said. "In 3 weeks. 3 weeks is enough time to prepare." He looked at her. "But it needs to be your choice. Every person who speaks, Sandra, Pete, Tyler, Gloria, Ruth, every one of them is making a choice. And you have to be willing to be the last one standing. The one who speaks after all of them. Because you're the current employee. You're the one whose experience is ongoing. Your voice is the one that completes it." Emily looked at him for a long time. "If I do this publicly in a room with David in it, he will look at you and he will try to make you feel the way he's made you feel for 3 years, Jack said. "He's going to try to make you small. He's going to try to make you doubt yourself. He's going to try to make you feel like everyone in the room thinks you're making it up." He held her gaze. "And I'm going to be sitting in that room, and I'm going to look at you, and I need you to look back at me when it gets hard and remember that you're not making it up and that you are not alone and that every single person in that room either knows the truth or is about to." Emily breathed in, out, the breath of someone calibrating their own nerve. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks, Jack confirmed. What happened over the next 21 days was quieter than the drama of it might suggest from the outside. There were no confrontations, no threats, no dramatic scenes in the parking lot. David Reynolds continued to run his diner with the confidence of a man who has been unchallenged for long enough to believe challenge is not possible. He was sharp with Emily, and she bore it. He was dismissive with Marcus, and Marcus bore it the way he always had. The diner operated on its surface exactly as it always had. But underneath the surface, things were moving. Sandra Kowalski finished her account, 6 typed pages, single-spaced, signed and dated, and brought it to Diane Cho directly. She had also, in the course of writing it, remembered a detail she had suppressed. David had once suggested explicitly that her job security was connected to how agreeable she was willing to be in non-work contexts. She hadn't understood at the time, or had refused to understand, but writing it down at 51 years old with 3 years of distance, she understood it perfectly. And she was furious, not the hot reactive fury of the immediate moment, but the cold, deliberate fury of someone who has had time to fully understand what was done to them. That kind of fury was useful. Tyler, the former busboy, turned out to have something nobody had expected. He had a text message, sent from David's personal phone to Tyler's phone on the night Tyler had witnessed the register incident 3 years ago. The text said, "What happens at the restaurant stays at the restaurant. You understand me?" Tyler had never deleted it. He hadn't known why he kept it. Maybe some instinct had told him it might matter someday. He had shown it to Jack with the expression of someone pulling a buried thing into light. Jack had looked at that text message for a long time. Then he had said, "Tyler, do not delete that, ever." "I won't," Tyler said. "Does anyone else know you have this?" "No, I never told anyone." Jack had photographed it 3 times from different angles and sent all 3 photographs to Diane Cho within the hour. And Diane Cho had called him back in 15 minutes and used the word significant twice in the same sentence. Pete Larson, meanwhile, had started talking. Not publicly, not yet, but in the way that people do when a truth they've been suppressing suddenly has permission to exist. He had told his wife the full story for the first time, and his wife had told her sister, and her sister had mentioned it to someone, and by the end of the second week, there was a quiet, careful conversation beginning to move through certain parts of Willow Creek. Nothing definitive, nothing that David would have been able to identify or confront. But a shift, the kind of shift that happens when a narrative starts to crack and air gets in. David felt it. Jack could tell he felt it from the way Emily described his behavior, more controlled than usual, more deliberate, like sex they're being watched, and is performing normalcy for an invisible audience. He had not yet done anything overtly aggressive, which Diane Cho said was actually a warning sign rather than a good sign. Men like this, she had told Jack on the phone, when they feel something closing in, they go one of 2 directions. Either they escalate, try to create a situation where they can claim the other person is unstable or problematic, or they go very still and very quiet, and they wait for an opportunity. "Which do you think he'll do?" "I think he's the quiet type," she said, "which means we need to move before he figures out the shape of what's coming." The community meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening. By the Friday before it, something happened that nobody had planned for. Marcus talked. Not to Jack, not to Diane Cho, not to Emily. Marcus talked to his wife at home in the kitchen after work on a Thursday night because he had been carrying something for 9 years and the weight of it had apparently reached a limit he hadn't known existed until he hit it. His wife called Emily. Emily called Jack. Jack met Marcus the next morning in the parking lot of a grocery store 3 blocks from the diner, which was the distance Marcus said he needed from the building to feel like he could speak freely. He was a broad man in his late 40s with a cook's posture, slightly forward-leaning, from years of working over a range, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets and his jaw tight and his eyes moving across the middle distance, the way people's eyes do when they're trying to decide how honest to be. Jack waited. He did not speak first. He had learned this with Marcus specifically, that some people, when they've been silent a long time, need the silence honored rather than filled. Finally, Marcus said, "I saw him take money from the register. More than once. Not the situation with the boy, different times." I said nothing. He stopped. I told myself it was his restaurant and it wasn't my business. "Okay," Jack said. "I also saw him follow Sandra into the storage room once. I don't know what happened in there. She came out 2 minutes later and she didn't look right, and I asked if she was okay and she said yes. I believed her because I wanted to believe her." His jaw moved. "I've thought about that a lot. What made you decide to talk?" Marcus looked at him for the first time directly. "My daughter," he said. "She's 20 years old. She's working her first real job this summer. And I thought about if something like what's been happening in that kitchen happened to her, if someone treated her the way he's treated Emily. And I thought about the fact that I've been standing in that kitchen for 9 years watching and saying nothing." He paused. "And I couldn't make that okay in my head anymore. I tried, I really tried, but I couldn't." Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Would you be willing to speak at the community meeting Tuesday?" Marcus closed his eyes for a second. "Yes," he said. When he opened them, he looked like a man who has just put down something heavy. "Yeah, I'll be there." That was Friday. On Saturday, David Reynolds called Emily into his office. She texted Jack immediately. He wants to see me, alone, now. Jack texted back, go. Don't volunteer anything. Short answers. Text me the second you're out. She went in at 2:30. She came out at 3:15, 45 minutes. His phone lit up. He knows. I don't know how much, but he knows something. Jack called her. She answered on the first ring. Tell me exactly what he said. Word for word, as close as you can. Her voice was shaking for the first time in days. He said he'd heard I'd been talking to people. He said he didn't know what I thought I was doing, but that he wanted me to understand that loyalty was important to him. That employees who were loyal were taken care of, and employees who weren't, he said the word consequences. Not in a threat exactly, just the word, sitting there. Did he mention anyone by name? No, he didn't say he knew about the attorney. He didn't say he knew about the meeting. He was so careful, she paused. He said he'd heard I'd been talking to a customer. He said the biker who kept coming in had been making people uncomfortable. Jack absorbed this. What did you say? I said I didn't know what he meant. I said you were just a regular customer. Her breath was uneven. Jack, he's watching. He's been watching this whole time and I didn't know. Emily, steady. Listen to me. He doesn't know what we have. He doesn't know about Tyler's text. He doesn't know about Diane's show. He doesn't know about Sandra's statement or Pete's account or Marcus. Marcus, you talked to Marcus. Yesterday, he's coming Tuesday. A sharp intake of breath. Marcus is coming Tuesday. He's coming Tuesday, Jack confirmed. The silence on the other end of the line was not an empty silence. It was full of the sound of someone processing a reality that kept expanding in a direction they hadn't expected. Emily had thought she was alone. Then she had thought she had Jack. Then she had Sandra and Pete and Tyler and Gloria and Ruth. And now Marcus, the man who had stood in that kitchen for 9 years and said nothing, and who had finally said enough. He won't see it coming, Emily said quietly. No, Jack agreed, he won't, because he thinks we're still afraid of him. Yes. She was quiet for another moment. Then something in her voice changed. Steadied. The way metal changes when it cools becomes more itself, harder, truer in its shape. Good, she said. Let him think that. Jack said nothing. He let the silence confirm it. Tuesday, Emily said. Tuesday, he said. The weekend was the hardest part. The waiting always was. Jack stayed in Willow Creek, kept his distance from the diner. Let Emily carry the weight of the normal Saturday and Sunday shifts, with David watching her and her watching her back, and both of them performing a version of ordinary that neither of them felt. On Monday evening, the night before the community meeting, Jack gathered everyone, not in a dramatic way, not in a basement, with a whiteboard and a mission statement, but in Ruth's apartment, because Ruth's apartment was safe and Ruth made coffee, and there is something about a domestic setting that makes people feel like what they're doing is real, rather than a story they're telling themselves. Sandra was there. Pete, Tyler, Gloria, Marcus, who arrived last and was greeted by Emily with a look that said 10 things neither of them would ever need to put into words. Diane's show joined by phone on speaker, a disembodied voice from Kansas City that was nonetheless one of the most present voices in the room. Diane laid it out clearly. The meeting tomorrow was a public forum. It was not a legal proceeding. Nothing said there would have the force of sworn testimony. What it would have was the force of community witness. Multiple people speaking independently with documented accounts describing a pattern of behavior. The goal tomorrow, Diane said, is not to destroy David Reynolds. The goal is to tell the truth, clearly, specifically, without exaggeration and without minimizing. The truth will do the work. Your job is just to say it. She gave practical guidance. Speak in first person. Stick to what you personally experienced or observed. Don't speculate about motivations. Don't editorialize. Just the facts of what happened, when, and how it affected you. And then she said Emily goes last. That's important. Each of you creates context. Emily's account is the current one. It's ongoing. It's documented. And it's the one that anchors everything else. When she speaks, the room will already understand what kind of man they've been dealing with. After Diane hung up, the room was quiet for a moment. And then Tyler, 19 years old, with the straight-backed energy of someone who had been waiting 3 years to say something, looked around at the group and said, "He's going to try to make us look crazy tomorrow." "Probably," Jack said. "What do we do when he does that?" Jack looked around the room. Sandra with her 6 pages and her cold fury, Pete with his battered reputation and his family name, Marcus with 9 years and a daughter who was 20 years old and working her first real job, Gloria with his guilt of having witnessed something and said nothing at the time, Ruth with 4 pages and 2 years of left meals and a watching heart, and Emily sitting at the edge of the group, her journal on her lap, her hands still. "You say it anyway," Jack said. "You look at him and you say what happened and you let him say what he wants after. Because the truth doesn't need defending. It just needs saying. Enough times by enough people in enough of the same direction. Until the room can't look away from it anymore." Tyler nodded. He looked at Emily. "You ready?" Emily looked up from her journal, and for the first time in the 3 weeks since she had whispered 3 words to a stranger over a cup of coffee, she did not look like a person who was holding herself together. She looked like a person who was held. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." The Tuesday of the community meeting arrived the way consequential days always do, looking exactly like every other day until it doesn't anymore. Emily worked the morning shift. She had insisted on it. Jack had told her she didn't have to, that she could call in sick, that nobody would blame her. And she had looked at him with an expression that was patient in the specific way of someone explaining something obvious to someone they nonetheless like. "If I don't show up," she said, "he'll know something is happening. I want him walking into that meeting tonight thinking he has the upper hand." Jack had looked at her and thought not for the first time that the woman David Reynolds had spent 3 years trying to convince was incompetent, was in fact one of the sharpest people he had met in a long time. So Emily worked the morning shift. She smiled at customers. She refilled coffee. She took orders and delivered plates and cleared tables and did every single thing she had done every single day for 3 years, except that today her hands didn't shake once. David watched her the way he always watched her, that proprietary evaluating attention that he wore like a second skin, and she gave him nothing. No tells, no cracks. She was a professional, and she had always been a professional, and today of all days she was going to let him remember that. Jack spent the morning at the motel going over everything with Diane Cho by phone one final time, the written accounts, Tyler's text message, which Diane had already forwarded to 2 colleagues for assessment, the email chain between Emily and David's cousin about the apartment, which Emily had found in an old folder and which Diane had described with controlled professional excitement as extraordinarily useful. The labor board complaint that Diane had helped Emily file the previous week, quietly, procedurally, the kind of thing that exists in a system before it ever surfaces in public, which would provide the formal legal spine for everything that happened after tonight. "How is she?" Diane asked at the end of the call. "She's working her shift," Jack said. A pause. "Good Lord," Diane said quietly. And then with the warmth of someone who had spent a career being moved by people's capacity to hold themselves together. "She's going to be okay." "Yes," Jack said, "she is." The community meeting was held at Willow Creek's Town Hall, a building that also served as the public library on weekday mornings and the venue for the occasional town council session. It was not a large space. It held maybe 120 people comfortably, and by the time the doors opened at 6:30 that Tuesday evening, there were already 40 people outside waiting to get in. Jack noticed this and said nothing, but he filed it away. Word had moved through Willow Creek in the careful, lateral way that word moves through small towns, not announced, not broadcasted, but shared. From Pete Larson's wife to her sister's neighbor. From Gloria to 3 women she had coffee with on Sunday mornings. From Ruth to the women in her building, 2 of whom had their own quiet observations about Emily that they had never shared with anyone. The town had not been told to come. The town had simply heard that something was going to happen, and the town had decided it wanted to see. David Reynolds arrived at 6:45 with his brother-in-law, a man named Carl, who sat on the town council and who had the bearing of someone who has never yet been in a room where his presence wasn't welcome. David was dressed well, jacket no tie, the specific calibration of someone who wants to look authoritative but not formal. He looked at the crowd in the hall, and Jack watched him do the math, watched the slight stiffening of his posture as the numbers came up larger than he'd anticipated. David had expected this to be routine. He had expected maybe 30 people, most of them familiar faces who owed him goodwill or who simply didn't want trouble. He had expected to sit in the front row and look like a pillar of the community while a few vague complaints were aired and then dispersed into nothing. He had not expected this, but he recovered fast. Jack had to give him that. David Reynolds recovered fast and he moved through the room, working it the way men like him. Workrooms, handshake here, nod there. The easy smile of someone who believes his charm is structural rather than performed. He spoke to his brother-in-law. He spoke to two men Jack didn't recognize. He did not look at Jack, who was sitting in the fourth row, which meant he was very aware of Jack sitting in the fourth row. Sandra Kowalski came in at 6:50 and sat 3 rows from the back. Pete Larson sat beside her, his large frame settled in the chair, with the careful stillness of a man conserving himself. Tyler arrived with his mother, which Jack had not anticipated, and the sight of a 19-year-old walking in with the woman who had raised him hit something in the room that was hard to name. Gloria sat near the aisle. Marcus came in last through the side door, and he sat in the second row, and he did not look at David, and David did not look at him, and the space between them was dense with 9 years of shared silence. Emily walked in at 7 o'clock exactly. She had gone home after her shift and changed nothing dramatic, just clean clothes, her hair down instead of pulled back. And she walked through the door of that town hall with her head up and her eyes clear, and she found Jack in the fourth row, and she looked at him, and he gave her the smallest nod he had, and she took a seat in the third row, one ahead of him, and slightly to the left, close enough that if she needed to feel his presence, she could. David saw her come in. His eyes found her the way they always found her, that automatic tracking that Emily had learned to sense before it was even directed at her. Something shifted in his expression. Just slightly. The calculation again, but faster, this time more urgent. He leaned over and said something to his brother-in-law. Carl looked at Emily and then looked away. The meeting was called to order at 7:15 by a woman named Helen Park, who ran the town council and who had the organized, no-nonsense manner of someone who has been managing civic meetings long enough to have seen most things. She explained the format. The meeting was a quarterly review of local businesses and community concerns, open comment format, 3 minutes per speaker, standard, procedural, ordinary. The first 3 speakers were ordinary: a man complaining about the condition of the road behind the hardware store, a woman asking about the timeline for the new playground equipment at the park, a retired teacher who wanted to discuss the library's reduced hours. David sat in his chair with his arms crossed and his face pleasant and patient, and he was very good at it. Then Helen Park said, "Next speaker, Sandra Kowalski." David's arms uncrossed. Sandra walked to the front of the room. She was wearing a blue cardigan, and she had her 6 pages folded in her hand, but she didn't open them. She had memorized what she needed to say. She stood at the front of the room and she looked at the community of Willow Creek and she said, "My name is Sandra Kowalski. I worked at the Blue Lantern Diner for 4 years. I left 18 months ago because the working environment had become something I could no longer function in safely. I want to tell you what that environment looked like." She told them, not all 6 pages, 3 minutes, she had 3 minutes, but the core of it, the criticism that escalated from professional to personal, the suggestion about her agreeableness outside of work, stated plainly now without the euphemism she had wrapped it in at the time. The incident she had buried for a year and a half that she now named directly in language that was careful and specific and impossible to misinterpret. The room was very quiet. David had gone still in a way that was different from his earlier stillness. The performance of patience had dropped, and what was underneath it was not quite anger and not quite fear, but something that existed in the territory between them. His brother-in-law Carl put a hand on his arm. Sandra sat down. Helen Park said, "Next speaker, Pete Larson." Pete stood up, 6'4", worn, work jacket, the kind of man whose physical presence alone would have made some people nervous. And he walked to the front of the room and he stood there, and he was not nervous at all. I was the opposite of nervous. He was the calmest Jack had ever seen him, which made sense because Pete Larson had been waiting for this moment for a year and a half and had had a great deal of time to prepare for it. "My name is Pete Larson," he said. "I was fired from the Blue Lantern Diner 2 years ago. David Reynolds told people in this town that I stole from him. I did not steal from him. I asked for extra hours to cover a medical bill for my daughter, and 3 days later I was terminated and accused of theft." He paused, and his voice was so level it was almost geometric. "There was no investigation. There were no charges. There was no evidence because there was nothing to find. What there was a man who needed a reason to get rid of an employee who had made a request he didn't want to accommodate. And in this town with his family's history here, his word was enough. He looked directly at David when he said the last sentence. David looked back. His jaw was tight. I have a written account, Pete said. Dated, signed in with specifics. I've provided a copy to a labor attorney. He paused. I just wanted this town to hear my name said in a room and know what actually happened to it. He sat down. The room had changed. Jack could feel it, the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not dramatic, not sudden, but real. The quality of attention in the room had shifted from polite civic interest to something more alive, more alert. People were sitting forward. The couple near the back who had been on their phones were not on their phones anymore. David's brother-in-law leaned toward him again. Jack could see David shaking his head slightly, almost imperceptibly. Not yet. Tyler went next. 19 years old, his mother in the third row, with her hands folded in her lap and her face proud in the quiet way that mothers are proud when their children do hard things. Tyler stood at the front, and he was young enough that the room felt the specific weight of a teenager who had carried an adult secret for 3 years. And he said, when I was 16, I worked at the Blue Lantern on weekends. I saw David Reynolds take cash from the register on a Thursday night when he thought no one was in the kitchen. I saw it. And after he realized I'd been there, he sent me a text message that said, and I have this text, I have it right here on my phone. I've had it for 3 years. He sent me a text that said, what happens at the restaurant stays at the restaurant. You understand me? He held up his phone. A sound moved through the room, not loud, more like the sound of an intake of collective breath. David moved. He didn't stand up. He shifted forward in his chair and his hand came up and he said, not shouting, but projecting in the voice of a man who has used his voice as a tool for years. That's completely out of context. That text was about a personnel matter that Helen Parks said calmly and firmly. Mr. Reynolds, this is an open comment session. You'll have an opportunity to speak. Right now, Tyler has the floor. David sat back. But the damage or the revelation, depending on which side of it you were on, was done. Because David Reynolds had just interrupted a 19-year-old boy in a room full of people, and the room had felt it, and the room had an opinion about it, and that opinion was written plainly on faces that David was going to have to see at the grocery store, and the gas station, and the post office for the rest of his time in Willow Creek. Tyler sat down. He looked at his mother, and she reached over and squeezed his hand once. Gloria spoke. Her voice shook slightly at the beginning, and then steadied. She described what she had seen 8 months ago. Emily reduced to tears in a dining room full of customers. David's voice, the specific words she remembered, the table of people who had looked at their food because they didn't know what else to do, and her own walk home afterward, and the guilt that had lived in her since. I should have said something then, she said. I didn't. I'm saying it now. Then Marcus. When Marcus stood up and walked to the front of the room, David's eyes tracked him with an expression that was the closest thing to shock Jack had seen on his face all evening. Marcus had been in that kitchen for 9 years. Marcus was the one who had stayed. Marcus was the one David had counted on implicitly and completely to be the permanent silent witness to everything that happened behind those kitchen doors. Marcus stood at the front of the room and he looked at the floor for a second. Then he looked up. I've worked at the Blue Lantern for 9 years, he said. I've seen things I should have spoken up about a long time ago. I didn't, and I have to live with that. But I'm not going to add to it by staying quiet tonight. He looked at David directly and held his gaze, which he had never done in 9 years of working for him. I saw him take money from the register. More than once, I saw him treat Emily Parker and Sandra before her and others in ways that no employer has the right to treat another human being. I stayed quiet because I was afraid and because I told myself it wasn't my business. My daughter is 20 years old and she's working her first job this summer. That's why it's my business. He sat on. The room was profoundly, completely silent. And then Helen Park said, Emily Parker. Emily stood up. Jack watched her stand up. He watched the moment she left her seat and turned to walk to the front of the room. And he watched the room watch her. And he felt something that he recognized as the sensation of being present at a moment that matters not for history, not for records, but for the particular human value of a truth that has finally found its voice. She stood at the front of the room. She did not have papers in her hand. She had her journal. She held it at her side, not open, just held the way a person holds something that has been important to them. And she looked at the room, and then she looked at David Reynolds, and she looked at him long enough that the room noticed, And then she said, "My name is Emily Parker. I've worked at the Blue Lantern Diner for 3 years. For most of that time, I believed what David Reynolds told me about myself, that I was incompetent, that I was lucky to have the job, that no one else would want me, and that I had nothing to offer, and that my understanding of my own work and my own worth was wrong, and his understanding was right." She paused. "I believed it because he was consistent, because he said it every day in ways large and small, in front of customers and behind closed doors, until the repetition of it replaced my own voice inside my head." Another pause. "That's how this kind of thing works. It doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. Small things over time until a person can't remember what they thought about themselves before." She opened the journal, not to read from it, just to hold it open to acknowledge its existence. "I started writing things down," she said. "I have 37 entries in here. Dates and times and specific incidents and the exact words used. I have documentation of tips that were docked without legitimate cause. I have a paper trail of a housing arrangement, an apartment rented through David's cousin at a below-market rate, an arrangement that was described to me as a benefit and that functioned in practice as a method of control." He looked at the room. "And I have the accounts of the people who spoke before me tonight, people who went through their own versions of the same thing in the same building year after year, and who stayed quiet because they believed, like I believed, that their word alone wasn't enough." She looked at David one more time. "It turns out that when people stop staying quiet at the same time as she said, the word is more than enough." She sat down. The room erupted. Not in chaos, in the contained, directed eruption of people who have been holding a reaction and have finally been given permission to have it. People talking to each other low and urgent. A man in the back saying loudly enough to be heard over the noise that he'd had his own issues with David's business practices. Years ago, nothing as serious, but a woman saying she'd always felt something was wrong when she watched him with the staff always. Helen Park called for order twice before she got it. And David Reynolds stood up. He had been composing himself during Emily's speech. Jack had watched him do it. Watched the visible effort of someone who is experienced at controlling situations, trying to find the control point in a situation that has slipped past all the usual control points. And he stood up and he looked like himself. Authoritative, certain. The man who had been unchallenged in this town for 20 years. "I have a right to respond," he said to Helen Park. "You do," Helen said. 3 minutes. David turned to the room. "I've lived in Willow Creek my whole life," he said. "My family built that restaurant. I've employed people in this town, contributed to this community for 2 decades. And tonight I've sat here and listened to a series of accusations from former employees, people who left under difficult circumstances, and who have clearly found each other and constructed a narrative." He was smooth. He was very, very smooth. "Sandra Kowalski left because her performance was deteriorating. Pete Larson was terminated for cause. That cause was theft, and I stand by that." He looked at Tyler. "A text message taken out of context does not constitute evidence of anything. And Marcus," he looked at Marcus. 9 years, Marcus. 9 years, and this is what you do." It was a masterpiece of a deflection. Even now, even in this room with everything that had just been said, David Reynolds was good enough at this to make some people doubt. Jack could see it, the slight wavering in a few faces, the uncertainty that this kind of confident denial can create, even in people who should know better. And then David made his mistake. He looked at Emily. He looked at Emily the way he had looked at her for 3 years, with the particular proprietary authority of someone who believes they own the narrative. And he said, "Emily has been an employee who required a great deal of management. I have been patient with her. What she's describing tonight is a failure to distinguish between appropriate management and mistreatment, which reflects her inexperience more than her inexperience," said a voice from the second row. Marcus. Marcus had stood up without being recognized. He was not at the front of the room, he was not following the format, and he did not appear to care about either of those facts. He was standing in the second row looking at David Reynolds with 9 years worth of something, finally fully released. And when he spoke, his voice was not angry, which made it more powerful than anger. "She has been there for 3 years, Marcus said. She has never been late. She has never been rude to a customer. She has never made a mistake she didn't own and correct. She memorizes every regular's order. She covers shifts when no one asks her to. She is the best employee that restaurant has had. In the 9 years I've been standing in that kitchen, and you have spent 3 years making her believe she's worthless. Because that is what you do when you are afraid of someone who is better at their job than you expected them to be. The room was very quiet. David said quietly and dangerously, "Marcus, sit down." "No," Marcus said, simple, final, the monosyllable of a man who has made a permanent decision. And in the audience, something changed, not gradually, this time suddenly, completely, the way a tide turns. Carl, David's brother-in-law, had stopped putting his hand on David's arm. Helen Park was watching David with the expression of someone who has heard enough to have formed an opinion. The two men David had spoken to before the meeting were not looking at him. The room had made its assessment, and the room was not with him. David Reynolds sat down. He sat down because he had no other move. Every avenue of control he had constructed, reputation, community, standing, the narrative of the incompetent employee, and the unjust accusation had been dismantled in the space of an hour by the people he had most counted on to stay silent. And the last one standing, the one whose assessment of Emily Parker had just rung through that room with the authority of 9 years and an irreversible personal cost, was the man David had always believed he owned most completely. That was the moment David knew it was over. After the meeting, everything moved quickly, in the way that things move quickly once the logjam breaks. Helen Park spoke to Diane Cho by phone the following morning. The labor board complaint that had been filed the previous week now had a room full of witnesses to its substance. A local newspaper reporter who had been in the audience called Emily that same night, and Emily said calmly and clearly that she would speak to the press when she was ready and not before, because Diane Cho had advised her exactly how and when to handle media contact. David made 2 moves in the 3 days following the meeting, and both of them were mistakes. The first was that he called Emily and told her not to come in Thursday. She was suspended, he said, pending a review of her conduct. She said, "Okay, I'll be in contact through my attorney." And she hung up, and she sat on Ruth's couch, and she called Diane Cho, and Diane Cho said with great satisfaction, "He just handed us a retaliatory suspension. That's a gift. Thank him for me." The second mistake was that David's cousin called Emily and told her the lease arrangement for her apartment was being restructured. Full market rate effective 30 days from now. Emily said, "I understand. I'll be in contact about that as well." She hung up and she called Jack, and Jack said, "Rachel Morgan has already found you 3 options for housing within your price range. We'll look at them this week." Emily was quiet for a second. Then she said, "He thinks he's punishing me." "Yes," Jack said. "He still thinks I need him," she said. "After everything, he still thinks I'm going to fold." "He doesn't know you," Jack said. A pause. A long breathing pause. "No," Emily said. "He never did." Within 2 weeks, David Reynolds had retained an attorney of his own, which meant the situation had become formal enough that he could no longer manage it through intimidation alone. Diane Cho had filed with the State Labor Board. The wage theft documentation, Emily's records, plus the accounts of former employees, had been reviewed by a second attorney, a colleague of Diane's who used the word compelling more than once. The town of Willow Creek, which had collectively witnessed the community meeting, was in the process of doing what small towns do when they have seen something they can't unsee. They were talking about it, and the story they were telling was not David's story anymore. 3 weeks after the meeting, David Reynolds announced that he would be stepping back from day-to-day operations of the Blue Lantern Diner while certain business matters were being resolved. The announcement was worded carefully in the legal adjacent language of someone who has been advised not to admit anything, but who has also been advised that continuing as normal is no longer tenable. Stepping back was a polite way of saying what everyone in Willow Creek already understood. Jack called Rachel Morgan the day the announcement came out. "It's time," he said. "Tell me what you're thinking," Rachel said. "I'm thinking the diner has bones," Jack said. "Whatever David built on top of it, the original structure, the location, the customer base, the fact that this town wants a place like that to exist, that's still there. It just needs someone to run it who doesn't make people afraid." "What about Emily? What about her? Is she thinking about what's next for herself?" Jack thought about the conversation he'd had with Emily the previous week. She had mentioned, almost casually, almost in passing, the way people mention the things they most want, because mentioning them directly feels too dangerous, that she had always been good at organizing, at managing schedules and inventory and staff. She'd said she had done it unofficially at the diner for 2 years, covering for gaps that David's actual management had left, and she'd done it naturally, almost without realizing she was doing it. "She's thinking about it," Jack said. She just doesn't know that she's allowed to think about it yet. Let me come to Willow Creek, Rachel said. She arrived on a Friday by car because Rachel Morgan did not own a motorcycle and considered this one of the few reasonable choices she had made in her life. And she sat down with Emily at Ruth's kitchen table, which had become the unofficial headquarters of everything that was happening. And she opened her laptop and she showed Emily a business plan. Not a complete plan, an outline, a structure, the bones of something. Emily looked at it for a long time without speaking. This is what it could look like, Rachel said. New ownership structure, fair wages, a management philosophy that treats employees like human beings, which turns out to be good for business as well as being the right thing to do. She paused. The person running it would need to understand operations, customer relationships, inventory scheduling. They would need to know the existing customer base. They would need to have credibility in this community. She looked at Emily. You have all of those things. Emily looked up from the laptop. I've never managed a business. You've been managing one informally for 2 years, Rachel said. You've been doing David's actual job while he was busy doing what he did. The difference between what you've been doing and what this would require is a title, some training, and the authority to make decisions you've already been making without it. Emily looked at Jack, who was sitting across the table. You knew she was going to say this, she said. I knew she might, Jack said. I also knew you needed to hear it from someone who wasn't me. Someone who looks at businesses for a living and can tell you objectively what she sees. Emily looked back at Rachel. What do you see? Rachel didn't hesitate. I see someone who survived something that would have broken a lot of people, and I see someone who in the middle of surviving it was still doing the job better than the person who was supposed to be doing it. She closed the laptop. I see a manager. Whether you decide to become one is up to you. The silence in Ruth's kitchen was the particular silence of a life reconsidering itself. Emily's hands were flat on the table. Still, not shaking, they had not shaken in weeks. She looked at the closed laptop. She looked at Jack. She looked at Ruth, who was standing by the stove, pretending not to be listening, but who was absolutely listening, and whose expression was that of a woman watching something long overdue finally arrive. I'm scared, Emily said. Good, Rachel said. Scared means it's real. Scared means you understand the stakes. The only people who aren't scared of something like this are people who don't understand what it requires. Emily was quiet for another moment. Then she said, Okay, tell me what training looks like. And Rachel Morgan opened her laptop again. Outside on the street, the town of Willow Creek was doing what it always did on a Friday afternoon, people running errands, kids coming home from school, the ordinary rhythm of a place that had existed long before any of the people in it and would exist long after. The Blue Lantern Diner sat on its corner closed, now the sign unlit, the parking lot empty. It looked abandoned. It looked like something that had run its course. But in Ruth's kitchen, over a laptop and bad coffee, and the kind of conversation that changes the direction of a life, something else was beginning. Something that didn't have a name yet, but that was going to have one soon. And Jack Carter sat at that table and watched it start, and he felt something that was quiet and solid and real, the way the things that are actually important usually are. He felt like he had done what he came to do. He just wasn't ready to leave yet. Rachel stayed in Willow Creek for 11 days. She had planned to stay for 4. She extended it once and then again because the situation kept revealing new layers that required her particular kind of attention. Not just the business planning, but the human architecture. Underneath it, the relationships and histories and unresolved tensions that would determine whether any plan she put on paper had a chance of surviving contact with reality. She was not a sentimental woman. She had built her career on the ability to assess situations without the distortion of emotion, to look at broken things and see them clearly, not as they should be, not as the people inside them wish they were, but as they actually were. That clarity was her value. It was why people called her. But she had not been prepared for Willow Creek, and she would admit this later to Jack in a conversation that happened months after the fact, when enough distance existed to look back without the immediate weight of it. She had not been prepared for the specific quality of what she found in that town, the way a community could simultaneously fail someone and be ready when given the chance to do better. The way people who had been witnesses to something wrong could carry the guilt of their witness in silence for years. And then when the silence finally broke, bring everything they had to the repair. She had not been prepared for Emily. The training began the week Rachel extended her stay the second time. It was not formal. There were no textbooks, no curriculum, no classroom. It was the kind of training that happens in the actual work, in the hours that Rachel spent walking Emily through the mechanics of what running a business genuinely required. Inventory systems, staff scheduling, food cost analysis, vendor relationships. The labor law compliance that David had treated as optional and that Rachel treated as non-negotiable. Emily absorbed all of it with a speed that Rachel found frankly startling. Not because Emily was a prodigy, though she was sharper than most, but because so much of what Rachel was teaching her, Emily had already intuited and been doing informally without the framework or the authority. "You know this already," Rachel said at the end of the third day, looking up from a scheduling spreadsheet Emily had built from scratch. In 2 hours, that was better structured than anything David had ever used. "I've been watching the diner run wrong for 3 years, Emily said. "It's hard not to see how it should run instead." Rachel looked at her for a moment. "Do you know what the difference is between someone who watches something run wrong and imagines how to fix it and someone who actually fixes it?" "What?" "The first person waits to be given permission," Rachel said. "The second person understands that the permission is theirs to give." Emily absorbed this the way she absorbed everything quietly, completely filing it somewhere that wasn't surface level. "I've been waiting for permission my whole life," she said. It wasn't self-pitying. It was the tone of someone reading a map and identifying where they took a wrong turn. "I know," Rachel said. "Stop." That was the whole lesson. Stop. 2 letters. But Emily carried them around with her afterward like something she needed to touch periodically to confirm was real. The legal situation moved on a parallel track. Diane Cho was methodical, impatient, and relentlessly thorough. And the picture she was assembling from Emily's records, the former employees' accounts, Tyler's texts, the housing documentation, and the retaliatory suspension was by the end of the month a picture that David Reynolds' attorney was looking at with the specific expression of someone who has been handed a file and immediately understood that the advice they're going to have to give their client is not the advice their client wants to hear. David's attorney reached out to Diane on a Thursday. Settlement discussion. The phrase was used carefully, non-committally, in the way that legal communications use careful non-commitment to test the temperature of a situation before committing to anything. Diane called Emily immediately after. "He wants to settle," she said. Emily was in the middle of reviewing vendor invoices that Rachel had pulled from the diner's records. She set down the papers and said, "What does that mean practically?" "It means he's looked at what we have and he's decided he'd rather resolve this privately than have it proceed through formal channels," Diane said. "It means the evidence we've built is doing exactly what evidence is supposed to do." "What would a settlement involve?" "That's what we negotiate. Back wages, the docked tips comprehensively documented, compensation for the retaliatory suspension, a formal resolution of the housing situation, potentially more depending on how the negotiation goes." Diane paused. "Emily, I want to be direct with you. A settlement means faster resolution and guaranteed outcome. Proceeding formally means longer timeline, more exposure, but potentially greater accountability for the record, not just for you." Emily was quiet for a moment. "What do the others get from a settlement, Sandra, Pete, Tyler?" Diane had expected the question. She had learned to expect Emily to ask about the others before she asked about herself. And she had decided this was either the most generous quality she had encountered in a client or the most complicated, possibly both. "Their claims are separate from yours. Any resolution for them would be negotiated independently. But the strength of your collective case has created leverage that benefits everyone. I don't want to settle if it means he just writes a check and goes back to doing what he does," Emily said. "To someone else, somewhere else." "I understand that," Diane said. "And I have to be honest with you, a private settlement won't prevent him from opening another business. What it will do is create a paper trail, a legal record, references that can be checked. The community meeting has already done something that no settlement agreement can undo. It put the truth in a room full of people who live in this town, and that truth doesn't disappear because paperwork gets signed." Emily thought about this for a long time. Then she said, "Can we negotiate for something beyond money? Potentially, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about the diner," Emily said. "What happens to it? Whether it reopens? Under what terms?" Another pause. "Say more." "If he settles, if he resolves this by stepping away, Someone has to take over the business. Right now, it's just sitting there. The community meeting happened and people know what happened and the diner is closed. But the diner was somebody's dream before David Reynolds got his hands on it. His parents built it. And the town, she stopped. The town wants it back. I know they do. I've had 4 different people stop me on the street this week to ask what's going to happen to it. Diane was quiet on the other end, processing. Are you telling me, she said slowly, that you want to make the future of the diner part of the settlement negotiation? I'm asking if that's possible. Diane paused. It's not standard, but settlement agreements can include a wide range of terms. If David is motivated to resolve this cleanly, and based on his attorney's tone of voice this morning, there may be room for more creative structuring than a straightforward financial resolution. She paused again. Emily, is this about you running the diner? Emily looked at the vendor invoices. She looked at the scheduling spreadsheet she had built. She thought about the 11 days of Rachel's training and the 37 entries in her journal, and the 3 words she had whispered over a cup of coffee to a stranger who had answered. Yes, she said, it's about me running the diner. Jack was outside the motel when Diane called him 20 minutes later. He was sitting on the bike, not going anywhere, just sitting on it the way he sometimes did when he needed to think, the familiar weight of it under him, the smell of oil and metal in the road, the reminder of a life that existed outside of this town and this situation and would be waiting for him when he left. He would have to leave eventually. He had known this from the beginning. He had a life. He had roads he hadn't ridden yet and people he was supposed to see, in the particular freedom of a man who had arranged his existence around forward motion. He had never been built for staying, but he was still here. Diane said she wants to tie the diner's future to the settlement, specifically structured transfer of operational control in exchange for a comprehensive resolution of all claims. Jack has said, can you make that work? Possibly. The question is whether David is motivated enough to accept non-standard terms. My read from this morning is that he is. He's seen what happened at that community meeting. He knows this town has made its decision about him. Staying is costing him more every week than leaving would. And Emily takes over the diner. With proper legal and financial structure. Yes, she'd need investors or a small business loan. The transfer wouldn't be free, but the terms could be structured to make it accessible. Jack thought about Rachel Morgan's business plan sitting on Ruth's kitchen table. The bones of something. He thought about what Rachel had said to him the day before she finally left Willow Creek. Her suitcase already in the car, her laptop in its bag, her presence in this town, already transitioning from active to advisory when she had looked at him and said, she's going to need capital, not a lot, but something. Is there anything we can do about that? And Jack had said, I might know some people. He had said it vaguely because he had not yet decided whether he was going to do what he was thinking about doing. It was not a small thing. It was in the scale of his personal economics, a significant thing. But he had been thinking about it since the second week, since the conversation with Pete Larson in the truck, since Tyler's text message, since Marcus standing in the community meeting, saying no to a man he'd worked for 9 years. And by now it had stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like a fact that simply hadn't been announced yet. Tell Diane to start structuring the settlement terms, Jack said. I'll handle the capital question. He called Rachel back. How much are we talking about? He said. Rachel gave him a number. It was not small. It was the kind of number that required a serious conversation with yourself. He held it in his head for a moment, turning it over, checking its weight. Okay, he said. Jack, I know. This isn't Rachel. Okay, that's my answer. A long pause. She's not going to want you to do this, Rachel said. No, Jack agreed. She's going to argue about it. How are you going to handle that? Jack thought about Emily's face on the night of the community meeting when she had stood at the front of that room and said simply and completely the truth about what had been done to her and what it had cost her and what she was going to do about it. He thought about the particular courage of that, not the dramatic kind, not the movie kind, but the real kind, the kind that is ordinary and unremarkable, and that people do every day without anyone making a film about it. The quiet choice to say a true thing to a room full of people and trust that the truth will be enough. I'll tell her she's not the only one who gets to decide to help someone, Jack said. He called Pete Larson. He called Sandra Kowalski. He called Tyler's mother because Tyler was 19 and eager, and his mother was the one who understood what was actually being asked. He called Gloria, who cried on the phone and said yes immediately. He called Marcus, who was quiet for a long moment, and then said, "Tell me what you need." What he was building was not charity. It was investment, small individual amounts from people who had a stake in the outcome, who understood what the diner could become, and what it had already cost each of them in different ways. It would not cover everything. It covered enough. The rest Rachel handled through a small business development contact she had in Kansas City, who specialized in exactly this kind of situation, a woman-led business restart post-hostile environment with documented community support and a solid operational plan. It took 3 weeks to structure. During those 3 weeks, David Reynolds' attorney and Diane Cho negotiated in the careful, formal, slow-motion way that legal negotiations happen. And the shape of the settlement emerged gradually the way a photograph develops, first vague, then clearer, then finally sharp and complete and permanent. David Reynolds would step away entirely. The diner's physical assets, the building lease, the equipment, the inventory would transfer at assessed value structured as a sale with owner financing, at terms that Diane had negotiated down to something Emily could actually carry. The wage claims were settled comprehensively. The retaliatory suspension was formally acknowledged. Pete Larson's theft accusation, the one David had used to destroy his reputation in this town, was retracted in writing with an apology that Pete's attorney reviewed and approved. The apology was not large. It was 1 paragraph. But Pete read it 3 times and then folded it and put it in his jacket pocket and kept it there because it was the official acknowledgement that what he had known for 2 years was true, and there is a particular value in being told that the truth you've been carrying alone is real, even when you never stop believing it yourself. On the day the settlement was signed, Diane Cho called Emily at 9 in the morning. Emily was at Ruth's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the operational plan she had been refining for the past week, the one that was going to become the actual working document for reopening the diner. And she answered the phone and Diane said, "It's done." Emily set down her coffee. "All of it," she said. "All of it," Diane said. "Signed and finalized, filed. You are now pending the formal transfer process, the operational manager of the Blue Lantern Diner." The kitchen was very quiet. Ruth was at the stove. She had her back to Emily and she did not turn around, but her shoulders moved in a way that suggested she was feeling something she had decided not to perform. Emily said, "Thank you, Diane, for everything." "Thank Emily Parker," Diane said. "All I did was build the legal structure around something she already had the courage to start." Emily hung up. She sat there for a moment with her hands flat on the table, still completely still, the hands that had shaken for 3 years and that had stopped shaking on the night she had stood in a town hall and said her name and told the truth. She looked at Ruth's kitchen at the table where so much had been decided, at the morning light coming through the window and the cup of coffee going slightly cold, at the operational plan that was going to become real. Now that was going to require her every day and demand things of her she hadn't been demanded yet. Then she picked up the phone and called Jack. He answered on the second ring. "It's done," she said. "I know, Diane called me." "She called you first." "She calls me second," Jack said. "You first always." Emily was quiet for a moment. "The investment," she said. Her voice had a new edge in it, not hard but definite. She had been thinking about this for 2 weeks and she had decided how she felt about it. "I know what you did. Rachel told me. I know it wasn't just you. I know it was Pete and Sandra and Gloria and Marcus and Tyler's mom. And I need you to know that I will pay every single one of them back, every dollar, with interest." "Emily, not as charity," she said firmly, "as investment, which means returns, which means I need to actually run this thing well enough to generate them. So I need you to tell them that. I need you to tell them it's not a gift, it's a bet, and I intend to win it for them." Silence on his end. Then, "I'll tell them." "Good." A pause. "Jack?" "Yeah. I need to tell you something and I need you to actually listen and not deflect." "I'm listening." "What you did." She stopped. Started again. "I've been trying to find the right way to say this for weeks. I don't think there's a right way. I think there's just the true way." Her voice was steady in the particular way it had been steady since the night of the community meeting. Not the forced steadiness of before the held together kind, but the real kind, the kind that comes from having gone through something and come out the other side, knowing your own weight. You didn't just help me. You reminded me that I existed. That sounds small. It's not. When someone has spent enough time being told they don't matter, they stop being able to feel their own edges. They stop knowing where they end, and the thing that's hurting them begins. And you walked into that diner and you looked at me like I was a whole person, and you asked me a real question, and you waited for a real answer, and I had forgotten what that felt like. I had forgotten I was allowed to take up space. She stopped. I just need you to know that. That's what you actually did. Not the settlement, not the investment, not the community meeting. That first night, the question. Well, be guys. Jack was quiet for a long time. Then he said, you did the rest. I know, she said, but someone had to do the first part. The reopening of the Blue Lantern Diner was set for a Saturday 6 weeks after the settlement was signed. Rachel had flown back for the week leading up to it, not because Emily needed her, but because Rachel had decided she wanted to be there, which was not a decision she made easily or often, and which she made without apology. She and Emily spent that week doing what needed doing: final inspection of equipment, review of the new staff schedule, a meeting with the vendor who was coming in Monday to restock the kitchen, a walkthrough of the new employee handbook that Emily had written herself from scratch over 3 nights at Ruth's kitchen table. The employee handbook was 14 pages long. It covered wages, scheduling, the complaint process, the standards of professional conduct for management as well as staff. Because Emily had been very specific about this, had told Rachel that the handbook had to be as clear about what management owed employees as about what employees owed the job. The place people were afraid to speak up in, Emily had said, is not the place I'm building. Rachel had read all 14 pages and had made 2 minor suggestions and said the rest was exactly right. Marcus came back. This was not guaranteed. Marcus had options, had been offered a position at a newer restaurant on the county road east of town, had a reputation as a cook that had survived David's shadow better than most people's reputations, had survived their associations with David. But he came back because Emily asked him personally in a phone call that lasted 40 minutes, and in which she told him clearly and without sentimentality that she wanted to build something, and that she wanted to build it with people she trusted, and that trust was something Marcus had earned in the second row of a town hall on a Tuesday night. Marcus said yes before she finished the sentence. She hired 2 new wait staff, a woman named Priya, who had been working double shifts at a diner 2 towns over, and who had references that made Rachel say, hire her yesterday, and a retired teacher named Dale who wanted part-time morning work, and who turned out to have the specific gift of making every customer feel like a regular from the first visit. She kept the same breakfast and lunch hours the diner had always kept, and added a Friday evening service that she had calculated based on 3 weeks of careful analysis of the town's demographics and existing restaurant traffic, would fill a gap the town didn't know it had been feeling. Sandra Kowalski came in the Thursday before the opening, ostensibly to pick up a takeout order she had called in, but she stayed for 2 hours, and she and Emily sat in a corner booth and talked, really talked for the first time, and something between them that had been held at a cautious distance by the formality of the legal process was released and became something warmer and more durable. Sandra left with the understanding that she was going to come in on Saturday morning to be one of the first customers, and that she was going to bring her sister, and the knowledge of this made Emily feel something she was still learning, to name the particular warmth of a relationship built on shared survival rather than shared ordinary circumstance. Pete Larson sent flowers. Big, slightly chaotic, entirely. Pete flowers, the kind picked out by someone with no experience picking flowers, but with the full and genuine intention behind them. Emily put them on the counter where everyone would see them and did not move them for a week. The night before the opening, Jack arrived. He had left Willow Creek 4 weeks prior after the settlement was signed and the immediate crisis was resolved, and he had looked at Emily's face and seen in it for the first time something that didn't require his presence to sustain it. He had left the way he arrived early morning without fanfare, just the sound of the Harley turning over in the motel parking lot, and the diminishing growl of it as it moved out onto the highway and became first small and then gone. He had not said a formal goodbye. He and Emily had not had a scene about it. She had known he was leaving. She had known for weeks that leaving was what he did, that it was structurally built into who he was, and they had sat on Ruth's porch the evening before and talked about nothing in particular for an hour, and when he stood up to go, she had said, "Don't disappear." And he had said, I won't. And that was the whole of it, which was exactly the right amount. He had ridden. He had done what he did miles and weeks, and the open road that was the language his life spoke most fluently. And he had thought about Willow Creek and about Emily and about the things that had happened in that town, and he had let the highway work on him, the way the highway always did, processing things through motion that couldn't be processed any other way. And then Emily had called him 2 weeks ago and said, we're opening Saturday. I want you here. He had not hesitated. What time? 8 in the morning, she said. We open at 8. He arrived Friday evening. He texted her from the motel, the same motel room 7 again, because the clerk recognized him and gave him the same room out of either sentimentality or superstition. And Jack had not objected, and she texted back, come to the diner. I want to show you something. He walked the 3 blocks. The diner was dark, officially closed until tomorrow morning, but the lights were on inside the working lights, and when he pushed open the front door, the little bell rang the same way it always had. Emily was behind the counter. She was going over the next morning's prep list, a clipboard in her hand, her hair up in the same practical ponytail she had worn every shift for 3 years, and she looked up when he came in, and she looked at him, and something crossed her face that was too quick and too full to name. Well, she said. Well, he said. He sat down at the counter, 3rd stool from the end. The same stool. She looked at the stool and at him, and she smiled, a real one, the kind that reaches the eyes, the kind he had watched her practice without knowing it, was practice for weeks before he saw the real version for the first time. She poured him coffee without being asked. He drank it. He looked around the diner. It was clean. It was genuinely deeply clean, the kind that comes from someone caring, rather than someone performing caring. The photographs on the walls had been dusted and in some cases replaced. The floor near the door was newly mopped. The glass vases on the tables had real flowers in them, small ones. Nothing extravagant, chosen for the particular reason that they suited the space. And there was something else, something more diffuse, harder to identify. The diner felt inhabited, cared for. Like somewhere that had a person responsible for it who actually took that responsibility personally. You did this, Jack said. We did this, Emily said. All of us. I mean the feeling of it, he said. You can feel the difference. Emily looked around the diner with the expression of someone who hasn't yet fully separated herself from the work enough to see it as others see it. Then she looked back at Jack. My first official act as manager, she said, was to remove the calendar from David's office wall. It was 18 months out of date. He'd never updated it. She paused. I thought about it afterward. 18 months of looking at the wrong month and not noticing. I think that's what happens when you've stopped actually seeing the place you're in. You stop updating it. Jack nodded slowly. I update everything now, she said. It's a management principle I'm considering making official. He looked at her. How are you? The question landed between them the way it always did when he asked it simply, directly, with the full intention of wanting a real answer. Emily considered it seriously. She set down the clipboard and leaned against the back counter and looked at the ceiling for a second, the way she did when she was actually thinking rather than formulating what to say. I'm tired, she said. Good tired, the kind that comes from doing something real. She paused. I'm scared most mornings when I wake up. I have about 45 seconds of something close to panic before I remember that the scared feeling is about something that's mine now. That the thing I'm scared of is something I chose. She looked at him. That's different. That's a completely different kind of scared. Yes, it is, Jack said. I called my mother last week, Emily said. For the first time since a long time. I told her what happened. Not everything, but enough. She cried. I cried. She paused. She asked if she could come visit. I said yes. Jack was quiet. She's coming in 3 weeks, Emily said. She's going to stay with Ruth because I don't have a guest room yet, and Ruth offered immediately because Ruth has no concept of not offering. Something in her expression went soft and complicated. She said she was proud of me, my mother, and I realized that I hadn't heard that from her in years. And I realized also that I had stopped needing to hear it before I allowed myself to do this. She met his eyes. That felt important. To have done the thing first and heard the pride after, instead of waiting for the permission to be proud before I moved. The diner was quiet around them. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car passed, ordinary and unhurried, the sound of a town in its normal Friday evening. not knowing or caring that tomorrow the place on the corner was going to reopen, and that what it was going to reopen as was something it had never been before. I need to tell you something, Emily said, before tomorrow, while it's still just us. Okay. She took a breath. In 3 years, not one person in this diner, customer, coworker, nobody asked me if I was okay and meant it. Not one person looked at me like I was worth looking at. Her voice was steady. You were in this building for maybe 20 minutes before you did both. I've been thinking about why. What was different about you? Emily. Let me finish, she said. I think the answer is that you weren't trying to get anything from me. That's it. That's the whole difference. David looked at me and saw something to control. Customers looked at me and saw a service. But you looked at me and you didn't want anything. You just saw a person. She paused. That's the rarest thing. I didn't know how rare it was until I experienced it. And now I know, and I am going to spend however long I run this place making sure that every person who walks through that door feels it, that we see them, that they matter here. Her voice didn't break, but it went very close to breaking and then steadied on the other side. That's what you gave me, not the settlement, not the investment, a standard. The experience of being seen so that I know what it feels like so I can give it to someone else. Jack looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he looked at her. You are going to be extraordinary at this, he said. He said it the way he said things that were true simply without decoration. Without the hedging that people put around statements they're not fully sure of. He was fully sure of this. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up his cup, topped it off from the pot, and set it back down. Be here at 7:30 tomorrow, she said. Help me open. I'll be here at 7:30, he said. He was. He was sitting on the front step of the diner at 7:15. When Emily arrived, she always arrived early. She always had. It was not a habit she had acquired from management training, but one she had carried her whole life. The particular sense that early was the only respectful way to arrive at something that mattered. And she stopped when she saw him and shook her head with something that was too fond to be exasperation. 7:15, she said. Your standard is good, he said. I adjusted. She unlocked the door. He followed her inside. For the next 45 minutes, they worked side by side in the early quiet of the diner, doing the things that open a restaurant. Coffee started tables, checked the front window, wiped down the sign in the door, turned from closed to open, which Emily did herself at exactly 8 o'clock with a deliberateness that Jack watched and did not interrupt because it was a private moment, even if he was present for it. She turned the sign. She stood there with her hand still on it for a second. Then she turned around and looked at her diner, her counter, her tables, her kitchen, where Marcus was already moving in the early warmth of a griddle, heating up her flowers on the tables, her photographs on the walls, her door with its little bell, and she breathed. Sandra Kowalski came through that door at 8:03 with her sister and sat at the counter. Pete Larson came at 8:20 with his wife and two of the guys from his construction crew. Tyler came at 9 with his mother, and his mother introduced herself to Emily as though they hadn't spoken on the phone, and Emily shook her hand and said thank you, and meant it in 5 different directions at once. Gloria arrived at 9:15 and sat in the corner booth she had always used and looked around the diner with the expression of someone who has been given back something they didn't know they needed. Ruth walked over at 9:30 and did not sit down, but stood at the counter and drank 1 cup of coffee and looked at Emily behind the counter with the eyes of someone who has watched something become what it was always supposed to be. By 10 o'clock, the diner was full. Not full the way it had been full under David. The full of people eating because it was there and convenient and the coffee was acceptable. Full in the way that places are full when people actually want to be in them. Conversations at full volume. The sound of cutlery and plates and coffee cups and laughter. Priya moving between tables with the natural grace of someone born to the work. Dale at the counter charming the retired men who had come in as habit and were now staying longer than habit required. Marcus's food coming through the window, the same food it had always been technically, but tasting somehow different. The way the same ingredients in the hands of someone no longer cooking, in fear taste different, and people talking about it, remarking on it the way people do when a thing they thought they knew surprises them by being better than they remembered. Jack sat at the third stool from the end of the counter. And he watched all of it, and he did not say very much, which was appropriate because it was not his moment, and he knew it. At 11:30, Emily came and sat on the stool beside him for the first time all morning. The breakfast rush had crested and was beginning to ebb, and she had a cup of coffee in her hand, and she looked like someone who has been running at full speed and has just for the first time allowed herself to slow down enough to feel what she's been running toward. "How are we doing?" Jack asked. "We're doing," Emily said. She looked at the room. "We're really doing." He looked at her. "You okay?" She laughed. Not the sad laugh of the first night, the one that had sounded like the last air leaving a room. This one was real and warm, and sudden the laugh of someone who has been asked a question and finds to their own mild surprise that the answer is straightforwardly good. "Yes," she said. "I'm okay." She paused. "I'm actually okay." He nodded. He drank his coffee. "When are you leaving?" she asked. She asked it the way you ask about a thing you have accepted but want acknowledged. "Tomorrow morning," he said. She nodded. "Good breakfast first." "Obviously." She looked at him for a moment. "You know you can come back," she said, "whenever you want. Third stool from the end. It'll be here." "I know," he said. "It's going to be here a long time," she said. "I'm going to make sure of it." He believed her. He believed her the way he believed things that had the particular quality of being settled, rather than hope, not wishful, not fragile, but structural. The kind of truth that holds weight. The following morning, he was back on the highway before the town was fully awake. The Harley hummed beneath him with the familiar engine warmth that meant everything was right mechanically, which was the only kind of everything is right he had ever been able to control. The road opened ahead of him, flat and long and patient, the way roads always are, indifferent to where he had been and unconcerned with where he was going. Just there, just available, just real. He rode. Behind him, in the small roadside town of Willow Creek, a diner with a blue lantern sign was full of people having breakfast. A young woman with dark hair and steady hands was managing the floor with the ease of someone who has discovered that the thing they were built for was available to them all along, waiting only for the moment they decided to reach for it. A former cook was making eggs the way eggs are made when the person making them is no longer afraid. A 19-year-old was eating pancakes with his mother and feeling in the specific and irreplaceable way of someone who has done a hard thing and survived it completely like himself. And in the corner booth, an old woman named Ruth was finishing her second cup of coffee and looking at the room with the expression of someone who has lived long enough to know that most things go wrong and that some things against the reasonable odds of a world that does not owe anyone its grace go exactly right. Jack Carter had walked into a diner looking for a cheeseburger, and 3 words had changed his direction. He had never been the kind of man who needed to be thanked. He had never been the kind of man who needed to be remembered. He was the kind of man who, when someone reached out a hand in the dark and said, "Please," looked at that hand and made a decision, not because it was required of him, not because it cost him nothing, but because the ability to help and the choice not to were 2 things he had never been able to hold at the same time without one of them destroying the other. So he had helped. And the road ahead of him was long, and the engine was steady, and somewhere in a town he was leaving behind, something that had been broken was no longer broken. That was enough. That had always been enough. That would always be exactly enough.